Borrelia is a really stealthy and tricky organism, and if you don't treat it early, then what happens is it disseminates throughout the body. It can infect your skin, your joints, your heart, your nervous system, your brain, and lead to all sorts of symptoms that will make you feel pretty terrible. So, okay, you have some of these symptoms and you say, well, I want to go to my doctor and try and figure out if I have Lyme disease. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily going to be a simple answer. So I want to talk about a question that should be super simple, but unfortunately it's not. And that question is, what is Lyme disease? Right? It should be look it up in a medical textbook and get all the answers. But unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I want to talk about that today. What is Lyme disease? And most importantly, what it's not. So Lyme is basically a bacterial infection. A bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi causes the disease and gets transmitted to humans through ticks. So why should you care? Well, unfortunately, there's 500,000 new cases of Lyme every year. So if Lyme hasn't touched you or your family or your friends at some point, it probably will. One thing that's really important to know about Lyme is that it is the most treatable in the early stages of the infection. So recognizing the signs and symptoms is critical. So what are they? Well, LymeDisease.org did a study called My Lyme Data and basically asked thousands of Lyme patients that question. What were your first signs and symptoms? What were the top ones? Flu-like symptoms, headaches and neck stiffness, rash, joint pain, lightheadedness, shortness of breath and chest pain, shooting pains, Bell's palsy or facial nerve issues. All of those things could be a sign that you have Lyme disease. But you know what? Flu-like symptoms, well, that could be a symptom that you just have the flu. But the thing with Lyme disease is that your symptoms won't go away. Borrelia is a really stealthy and tricky organism. And if you don't treat it early, then what happens is it disseminates throughout the body. It can infect your skin, your joints, your heart, your nervous system, your brain, and lead to all sorts of symptoms that will make you feel pretty terrible. So, okay, you have some of these symptoms and you say, well, I want to go to my doctor and try and figure out if I have Lyme disease. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily going to be a simple answer. And the reason is that the medical community is really behind the times in terms of what the latest and greatest in research is. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I know for you rule followers out there, I'm one too. It sounds weird. You mean my doctor doesn't have the answers? Well, unfortunately, in this case, they might not. There's a lot of myths out there related to Lyme disease. So I want to talk about what are those top myths and what are the things that you're likely to hear that just aren't true. The facts show that it is absolutely not true. So I wanted to come up with the top 3 myths, but unfortunately there's so much misinformation out there in Lyme, I couldn't do it in less than 7. So I want to go through the top 7 myths in Lyme disease. Myth number 1. We don't have Lyme around here. You don't live in the Northeast or the Midwest, the upper Midwest, places where Lyme disease is endemic. We don't have Lyme, so therefore you don't need to be concerned. 100% wrong. The reality is that every single state in the continental US has reported cases of Lyme disease. Every single one. So yes, there are higher cases reported in the Midwest, upper Midwest, and in the Northeast, but it's basically everywhere. And ticks that carry disease are in all 50 states. And so just because you don't live in an endemic area doesn't mean that you didn't get Lyme disease. Myth number 2. You have to be outdoorsy to get Lyme. If you weren't hiking, hunting, out in the woods, then you probably didn't get Lyme disease. You're fine. You live in the city. Nobody gets Lyme in the city. Unfortunately, just dead wrong. Fair Health in 2019 actually did an analysis of 30 billion healthcare claims looking for trends in Lyme disease. You know what they found? They actually found that the incidence and growth was higher in urban areas than it was in rural areas. What? Yes, absolutely higher in urban areas than in rural areas. And so you do not need to live in the woods or be out hiking or so forth in order to contract Lyme disease. Another fun fact is that ticks that can transmit Lyme have been found in 17 out of 24 parks in New York City. So you can go on a vacation to New York City and come back with Lyme disease. So absolutely not true that you need to be outdoorsy. The other thing to know is that if you have pets, you're going to have a higher exposure to ticks. So even though you may not have gone outside, your pets usually do. And you're almost 2 times as likely to find ticks crawling on household members if you have a dog or cat living in your household. And so even though you may not have been outside, your pets may be bringing those ticks inside to you. Myth number 3. You can't get Lyme in the winter. It's December, so it's really unlikely that you got Lyme. Unfortunately, also not true. That same analysis of 30 billion healthcare claims found that Lyme happens year-round. January, December, February, all those months that you've been told, well, you can't get bit by a tick. Guess what? You can. And Lyme disease happens all 12 months. Yes, it spikes in the summer months, but that doesn't mean that you can't contract it when it's wintertime. Myth number 4. No tick, no Lyme. If you didn't see a tick on you, then you probably don't have Lyme disease. Well, again, LymeDisease.org surveyed patients, and the reality is 59% of those patients that actually have Lyme diagnosed don't recall a tick bite. Ticks are super small. They're hard to see. They can be in weird places like your hairline or on your back or in between your toes, places that you might not necessarily look every day. So just because you didn't see a tick bite doesn't mean that you haven't been bitten. Myth number 5. No bullseye rash, no Lyme. I mean, Lyme disease comes with this characteristic bullseye rash, and you don't have one, so therefore you don't have Lyme disease. Unfortunately, that is 100% not true, and there are several studies that show this. Yes, the majority of patients do get a rash, but only 14% of people, 14%, not great odds, 14% of people get the bullseye, that classic bullseye rash that you see all these images of. The other people that get rash, 58% of Lyme patients, actually have other types of rashes. They may have a central blistering. They may be diffuse. They may be kind of bluish. They may be multiple rashes. And the reality is that these other types of rashes are often misdiagnosed. A study in 2004 actually showed that they're misdiagnosed 36% of the time. They may tell you that it's a spider bite or cellulitis or some other skin disease, but not Lyme disease. Unfortunately, also not true. And then finally, 28% of patients have no rash at all. So just because you didn't get a rash and you didn't see a red mark does not mean that you didn't get Lyme disease. Myth number 6. Good news! Your test came back negative. You don't have Lyme disease. This one's one of my favorites because unfortunately this is one of the biggest problems in Lyme disease. And the reality is that the standard of care test that's recommended by the CDC is just not accurate. In fact, a systematic review of 13 different studies of that test and its performance showed that the sensitivity was only 49 to 65%. 49 to 65%. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you have Lyme, you have a 35 to 51% chance of testing negative. What? You mean I can have the disease and about 50% of the time I can test negative? Yeah, I know. It's like a coin flip. Really not okay. And why is that? Well, these bugs are seriously sneaky. And so the way that they test for them is antibodies. But you know what? Antibodies peak way after you've had the infection, weeks after you've gotten the disease, when it's the most treatable. Right? And the other thing is antibodies that's your immune response. It relies on how strong your immune system is and what antibodies that you produce. And everybody's different. And so yours may not actually test positive. And so you may have the disease and still test negative. Myth number 7. We treated your Lyme disease. It should be gone. That can't be why you're still sick. In fact, have you seen a psychiatrist lately? It might be all in your head. You know what? There is tons of data and research out there that shows this is just not true. A prospective study out of Johns Hopkins University showed that 43% of patients treated for Lyme disease, and this is ideal treatment, diagnosed early, treated with the recommended protocol, 43% are still symptomatic after treatment. And almost 14% of those people are so sick that it impairs their quality of life. So they can't get up and do the things that they used to do on a day-to-day basis. So why is that? Well, the reality is that studies in cell cultures, mice, dogs, monkeys, and humans have all shown that the antibiotic treatment that we currently use for Lyme disease is not always capable of killing off the disease. So you may still have an infection. And newer test methodologies are out there. There's actually an antigen test given by Galaxy Diagnostics that will test to see whether you still have the disease. And in a study that was published, 41% of patients that are being monitored for persistent Lyme still tested positive for the infection. 41% still have active Lyme disease. What about the other, 59% of people? Well, they may have co-infections because, ticks carry a lot more than just Borrelia and Lyme disease, or they may have some other immune dysfunction that was triggered by the infection. Really is going to take more work to dig into root cause, but the reality is persistent Lyme exists. And just because you've been treated doesn't mean that you're going to be well. And you need to work with a doctor to figure out the root cause of why you're still sick. So these are the 7 myths. And when you go to the doctor, you may hear any one of these 7 things, plus maybe a few others. And I know that seems daunting, but you need to go to your doctor and you need to demand better. Don't let that person convince you that you're crazy and that you're not sick. Don't let them convince you to not get tested or to try newer test methods to look for Lyme disease, because this is a real issue that makes people really sick. And the further along that you get down the line, the harder it becomes to treat effectively. So demand better from your doctors. If you want more information on Lyme disease, go to Lyme Warrior's website. They have tons of patient-centered information, blog articles, videos, information, packets, pamphlets, emails, whatever you need in order to understand Lyme disease and other key tick-borne infections, because they're serious diseases that impact millions of people. And if your doctor wants more information or your healthcare provider wants more information, go to Invisible International. They have continuing medical education, CME credits, that teach all about how to properly diagnose and treat tick-borne illnesses. Demand better.